to me, that's why we have to be talking about bringing wolves back to Ireland.
Today, I'm delighted to be speaking to Pádraic Fogarty. Pádraic is an ecologist and also the campaigns officer with the Irish Wildlife Trust. The Trust aims to conserve wildlife and the habitats they depend on throughout Ireland, while encouraging a greater understanding and appreciation of the natural world and the need to protect it. Family membership is great value at only €55, including the Irish Wildlife magazine and the Badger Club Junior magazine. Pádraic is also author of the successful nature book, Whittled Away, Ireland's Vanishing Nature. In his book, he issues a provocative call to arms and presents an alternative path to lead us to a brighter future. He calls for the return of long-lost species like wild boar, cranes, and wolves, showing how nature and wildlife can recover hand in hand. You can contact Pádraic through his website, Openfields Ecological Services, and you can find his 5-star book, Whittled Away, on Amazon. If you'd like to support the Burren Nature Sanctuary conservation projects or find out about animal adoptions, please visit our website, www.burrennaturesanctuary.ie. Welcome, Pádraic Fogarty. Hi, Pádraic. It's lovely to speak to you in Castleknock in Dublin.
Hi, Mary. Nice to talk to you too.
Yeah, across the country. So you're an environmentalist, and you're still managing to keep up with your work in some kind of form at the moment. Is that right?
Yeah, I suppose a lot of our work is policy-based. I mean, a lot of our work is also based on communications and awareness raising. So, yeah, but missing the outdoors and missing the spring to some extent as well.
Yes, I bet. So that would be your role in the Irish Wildlife Trust and also as a conservation ecologist.
So I'm an ecologist, and sometimes I get paid for being an ecologist, and then for the Irish Wildlife Trust, I'm our campaigns officer. So I suppose that means, working on the big campaigns that we have, the big changes that we'd like to see happen in Ireland for wildlife, and I'm involved in some of their social media work as well. And so that's what I do for the Irish Wildlife Trust.
Thank you. That's great. So we'll go to the first question anyway. How did you become a nature lover? Would you like to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I suppose it goes back a long way. I was lucky enough to have grown up near Phoenix Park in Dublin. And I wasn't really allowed to wander around the Phoenix Park on my own, but I did it anyway and did it, snuck down with friends. And when you're 5 or 6, well, maybe a bit older than that, maybe more like maybe 8, 9, 10, the Phoenix Park was enormous. I mean, it's still pretty big, but it's at that age it really was an enormous wilderness, and it has some great wild areas. I remember at the time also it had a nature trail through the Furry Glen. I remember my mother bringing me down to the nature trail, and you'd pick up a map from the visitor centre that doesn't exist anymore, and they'd have things to find on it. You'd be looking for, cones that had been eaten by squirrels or whatever, mushrooms or whatever. But I really enjoyed doing that. And I had a teacher at the time as well, when I think it was 4th class, who was absolutely obsessed with nature. And, she made sure we grew up knowing the names of trees and animals and plants and poems and all that kind of stuff. So I suppose since then I was hooked.
Brilliant. So what's your favourite plant or animal? Have you something you could pick out in particular you'd like to talk about?
I've always been fascinated with whales, humpback whales in particular. I suppose because they for a number of reasons. I mean, they're beautiful animals. They travel such long distances, and I've always been always loved traveling. So I've always kind of imagined if I had to be another animal, I'd be a humpback whale. Going to the Arctic in the summertime and then traveling down through the oceans to the tropics in the winter time. It sounds like a wonderful life. And whales are such a metaphor for our own destruction. One of my favorite books is Moby Dick, and the obsession with killing off the great whales is in many ways a metaphor for our entire relationship with the planet. But I've never been lucky enough to see a humpback whale. I have been on whaling trips in Ireland. I've been down to West Cork, where you can see minke whales and fin whales and dolphins. But it's still on my wish list to see a humpback whale in the wild.
Oh, yeah, that's a wonderful animal. And where would you see a humpback whale?
Well, I mean, they do turn up in Ireland. I think you have to be incredibly lucky. They're not, because they are migrating. They do turn up to feed. I mean, there's been some amazing footage in Ireland where they've been, jumping out of the water and putting on these amazing displays. But I think you need an enormous helping of good luck to see something like that.
Good luck, and probably a lot of time sitting on a boat waiting for the perfect moment. Yeah, I hope one day you will see a humpback whale in reality. Did you have any moment in your life when you became or felt particularly spiritually connected to nature?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not particularly religious. I wouldn't really describe myself as a particularly spiritual person. I do feel a deep sense of connectedness. Maybe that's the same thing. I'm not quite sure. I do feel that we're all very much a part of what is going on around us, and certainly I feel that in particular places. I don't have to be off in the wilderness or staring out of the ocean to feel that. I enjoy watching the spiders and the little blue tits in the back garden sometimes, or the way things grow. I have an elder tree in my garden that planted itself, and it's an entire ecosystem all by itself. So I do feel that sense of connection with the living world around us.
Okay, so Pádraic, I know you've written the brilliant book Whittled Away, and I'll put the link in the show notes. It's a very successful book about the abundance of nature in Ireland and, what we have lost in the last even 30 years. Are there any positive actions you can suggest to people that they can do as individuals without feeling overwhelmed by this whole problem? That people could take to make a difference?
Yeah, I think it's a source of great frustration for a lot of people to see what's happening in the world and to maybe feel helpless in the face of the catastrophe that's happening, and it can be very overwhelming. I think for anybody, and the more you learn about it, maybe at times the more overwhelming it can get. But of course, that sense of powerlessness is not a good thing, because from the other side, we know that humanity can overcome great challenges. We have done so in the past, and the actions from every individual matter at the end of the day. Of course, we can't all be ministers or the heads of government or departments that can make decisions to make these things happen. But we do live in communities. We do live in a world of connections, not only with nature, but with the people all around us. And we can nurture those connections. We can have conversations about what is happening. That, to me, that is one of the most powerful things you can do, really, is to talk to people around you in an open and respectful way about these things. Many people don't fully appreciate the damage that is happening. Maybe, you can broaden out conversations, and lots of communities are doing that. I mean, one of the great things in Ireland, I was a judge for the Tidy Towns contest for over 10 years. I spent summers going around Ireland looking at the amazing work that communities are doing. In Ireland, we have extraordinarily strong community networks in Ireland, and that's a huge asset for us. So, I mean, if we can mobilize that kind of community energy at whatever level that is within your ability, then I think we'll really start seeing some changes. I mean, I think one of the reasons I wrote the book was because I didn't feel people really understood the extent to which nature has disappeared from Ireland. And of course, if you don't have that appreciation, it's not going to be on your list to do anything about it. So really, that's why I've felt, people have been saying for years, you can't be negative all the time and delivering bad news. But at the same time, if you don't have a picture of the full extent of the bad news or the damage, you're not going to be motivated to act proportionately to it. So, I hope my book wasn't so much bad news that people felt there was nothing that could be done, because there's an awful lot that can be done. And definitely individual action is important at the end of the day.
And in a wider sense, if you'd like to give us a few of the sad statistics first from the book, and then I know you looked at a more worldwide view where other countries had done some successful actions that possibly we as a country could mimic. So what are the few statistics that you can throw at us just to wake people up, I suppose?
Yeah, so you could imagine, and we all learned this in school, that Ireland was once covered in an oak forest, and I think some people have worked out that maybe up to 80% of Ireland was covered in this dense deciduous woodland with oaks and ash and yew trees. But today, only maybe 1.5% of Ireland has fragments of these woodlands remaining. That makes Ireland one of the most deforested countries in the world. And so it's striking when, we see, the Amazon on fire or deforestation in Southeast Asia, and people are horrified. But actually, the horror should be much closer to home when we see that kind of damage that has already occurred. Of course, the remaining part of Ireland, the bit that wasn't in forest, was wetlands and bogs, particularly, let's say, along the River Shannon or the west of Ireland. But less than 1% of our raised bogs are left intact. So, they've pretty much been wiped out by turf cutting and burning and agricultural practices and the peat mining that has been taking place by Burren since the 1950s. And of course, our farmland, up to 100 years ago, pollution from farms didn't exist. The farmers' fields were full of plants and insects and ground nesting birds like quail and corncrake and curlew, and they're all gone. They're literally, you go into a farmer's field today and you might see one type of grass, maybe you'll see some clover, but you won't see the insects, you won't find the ground nesting birds. All of those things are gone. And of course, the tragedy is what's been called the shifting baseline, this term that was coined by a fisheries scientist to describe how we look at the scenery and we think it's green and it's lush and it's full of nature. But because that's what we have grown up being used to. And we don't see what isn't there. We can't imagine the sounds that have disappeared, or the sights that have disappeared, or the smells that have disappeared. And so we think it's all normal and we carry on. And of course, that's the great danger, that we're spiraling downwards into this vortex of extinction without even really knowing about it. But the statistics are all there to show that we had this great richness and abundance in the past that has now gone.
Yeah, for an example, I have a great friend who's 83, and she came to Ireland 40 years ago first and did the drive from Kinbarra to Doolin. And the fields of wildflowers and orchids, and I know the Burren is still special for botany, but the difference in the hedgerows and the meadows, it's just black and white. We've fields of green now, not fields of colour, and nobody notices that. So on a wider scale, sort of government policy-wise, what one action could you see Ireland doing to help now with some of these issues, or one or two?
Yeah, so really the problem has come down to a lack of action at government level. There's no way of getting around that, and so obviously there's lots that can be done. There's lots that we've already said we would do but haven't done, and there's lots we still can do. I would say the number one action on my list would be to create a nature conservation agency in Ireland that was able to do its job. that was independent, that was able to present the science, to communicate the science about what's happening, and to be able to come up with advice for farmers, for fishermen, for people, for communities, for people living in towns and cities about what's the best thing that we can be doing. Of course, agencies only work if they're listened to. We also need other government departments, other government agencies, community bodies to actually listen to that advice. I mean, we see with the debate around climate change and nearer in time the debate about COVID-19, how listening to science, listening to the facts can be difficult at first. We saw that with the outbreak of coronavirus. But when we do listen to the virus, we do take the science seriously, we can act very quickly. So these things can be done. But definitely without a properly funded, functional nature conservation agency in Ireland, the other things that we want to happen can't flow from that.
I mean, they talk about this Green Deal, which with 100 billion euros from Europe next year. I'm not sure if that's going to help Ireland in any way. It doesn't seem to be there in black and white yet. Hopefully, maybe there'll be some funding for something like that.
Yeah, I think the problem has never been money. The problem has never been a lack of funding. The problem has been the very deeply ingrained belief that nature doesn't really matter. That, yes, it's nice to have. And of course, every politician likes to say how important nature is and we want to protect our biodiversity and our national parks and all the rest of it. When it comes down to it, they don't mean it. And so when they're presented with a choice between a motorway and protecting a woodland or a housing estate or protecting the freshwater pearl mussel, or the big decisions about where money should be spent, nature never comes out on top. And that's why we have laws in place to protect nature. We have, we have funding streams. They've always been there, but they've never been effective because that central belief that nature doesn't matter is so deeply ingrained. And I don't want to be overcritical of politicians because it's ingrained in all of us. We've grown up believing that economic growth is more important than protecting curlews or protecting bees or protecting fish in the sea. And that is what has led us on this awful death spiral that we find ourselves in at the moment.
So it's a question of sort of illustrating to people why it is valuable. I mean, do you remember Eddie Lenihan, the storyteller in Clare? He actually forced the motorway to change course because of a hawthorn tree, because it was a fairy tree. But he was one person who stood up and made a big fuss. And so they did divert the motorway, but we need the individuals, I suppose, that are shouting.
Yeah, and if you want to look at success stories in Ireland over the last decades of, where nature did win out, the community groups have really been at the forefront. The Burren itself was saved by community action. The time they wanted to build a visitor centre at Mullaghmore. That didn't go ahead. There were huge plans for enormous industrial fish farms in Galway Bay up until quite recently. They were brought to an end by community action. There were plans to bring in fracking in County Leitrim not that long ago, which had government support, and it was local community action that stopped it. So local community action is absolutely essential. What really needs to happen, and we saw that the Burren is a good example of this, success can be hard because, you need certain things to come together. You need the community support. You need the scientific support. And you need the government support. And you need all those three things for conservation to work properly. And we have lots of examples where one of those things is missing and then you don't get the results that you want. And of course, the Burren is great because we see the scientists and the farmers and the government agencies working together, supporting each other. And that's why the Burren is so successful.
And you need individuals, for instance, Patrick McCormack, there's a lovely video about saving the Burren and stopping the Mullaghmore Visitor Centre I still actually I think it's from the late 80s, maybe early 90s, I still have a rusty old badge that says Save Mullet More. But Patrick McCormack is in this lovely film. I'll put the link in the show notes, The Silver Branch. And he's really a poet, and he's a visionary. He's a farmer. He's just a regular farmer. But I think the stories and the creative arts have a place to spread the message. Do you have any nature books that might inspire people that you have liked during your life, or that you could recommend for people?
Oh, many. There are maybe two in particular that I have found very inspiring. One was Rachel Carson. And Rachel Carson is very famous around the world for writing Silent Spring, which really kicked off the environmental movement in the United States. But before she was writing about pesticides, she wrote a lot about the ocean. And she wrote the most wonderful book called The Sea Around Us, which is not a particularly big book. But I loved it so much because she's such a beautiful writer. And her writing was very much based in science. So she was an oceanographer, and she was able to communicate the science with a sense of wonder, which I think is such a valuable lesson for us today, because we really have to discover that sense of wonder. Of course, Rachel Carson she was hounded. She grew up in a very male-dominated society. A very, anti-science sentiment grew up around what she was saying. She was absolutely hounded and vilified by the pharmaceutical industry in a way that was very sexist, as well as, trying to protect their own economic interests as well. So I do think Rachel Carson still has an awful lot to teach us. The other book that was a great inspiration for the book that I wrote a number of years ago was called The Unnatural History of the Sea by a scientist from England, Callum Roberts. And his book was very influential for me because he talked about the sea going back hundreds of years. He went to the diaries of pirates in the Caribbean, going back to the 1400s, to look for clues about the absolute incredible abundance of life that lived in the sea over the centuries. And of course, this goes back to what I was talking about, shifting baselines. He was making the point, going back 20, 30 years isn't enough. Yes, there were more fish in the sea 30 years ago, but if you go back 100 years ago, the stories of fish in the sea are absolutely mind-boggling compared to what they are today. And I took that as great inspiration. So for my own book, I tried to do the same. I went back quite far into records. I found stories from Galway Bay in particular about the absolute teeming shoals of fish and sea life that lived in Galway Bay. The entire community of the Claddagh in Galway Bay was built up around rowboats, nothing more technologically advanced than that, fishing a huge variety of fish and sea life from within Galway Bay, not beyond the Aran Islands. And I think that those kind of stories really hit home, because today, you'd be lucky to see any kind of fishing boat in Galway Bay. There's virtually nothing going on from a commercial point of view in Galway Bay.
Yeah, and now that the fishing is sort of, I'm not sure if it's stopped altogether, but it's definitely wound down from the pandemic. We had 3 dolphins in the quay in Kinvara the day before yesterday, which has never been seen before by anybody that can remember in the village, which means there must be some food for them there, or maybe there's another reason they came in. But I'm really enjoying the book recommendations from this podcast. So if you could send us a list of all the other ones that you love, I'll put them on the show notes as well. That'd be really lovely for people.
Sure, I'd like to do that.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you. If you had a magic wand right now and you could do one thing for nature, what would you do, Pádraic?
Oh, I would transform people's relationship with nature. I think we can talk about changing all the laws we like. We can talk about all the money in the world going into conservation, if we don't change our relationship with nature, we're not going to fix the problem we're in at the moment. And what I mean by that is addressing the feeling that we all seem to have that we're more important as a species than all the other creatures around us. And we've grown up with this sense of dominion over the natural world, like we are in charge and we allow other species to exist. And of course, we frequently decide we can't allow certain other species to exist. There's lots of, a good example would be wolves, for instance. For centuries, wolves have been persecuted. They've been vilified in fairy tales, and we've just grown up believing that there's just absolutely no way that humans and wolves can live together. It's never us. People can understand that about wolves, but actually it spans across lots of other types of plants and animals as well. I live in the city where we have a lot of seagulls. And the anger some people feel that seagulls are allowed to just fly around and do what they want and, steal bread that I brought to the pond to feed the ducks. It's outrageous. And so we should be culling the seagulls because of this. That's really what I'm talking about. It even goes down to plants. Some people get very, very angry at the idea that ragwort can grow on the side of the road and nobody's doing anything about it. And I suppose this is what I'm talking about. We have to find our own place in the web of life, in the connectedness with the other things around us. The ragwort and the seagulls and the wolves and everything else have a right to exist. They have a right to their place on this planet just as much as we do as well. This is not an anti-human point of view. This is about finding our place in harmony with the other things around us. That's a very difficult thing to address because people get very, very emotional about it. But that's, in a way, that when that emotion comes out, that's exactly the point of having this debate and having this argument. And that's why, to me, that's why we have to be talking about bringing wolves back to Ireland, because this is why we have to have this debate. It's why we have to talk about not farming in certain areas. I know this is very emotional for people. We've grown up believing that farming is absolutely essential. And farming, we have to be farming everywhere. The tops of mountains, islands in the Atlantic Ocean, islands in lakes. Farming must be done everywhere. And but it doesn't. And we have to step back and decide, okay, we absolutely need farming, but not everywhere. We need to have working ecosystems with all the species in some kind of a balance with each other. So if I did have that magic wand, that would be my wish.
Oh, lovely. I had a magical experience driving up to Dublin last year, going up to the botany, I think it was the botany conference, and I stopped at traffic lights. And when the sky is really metal grey, but the light is underneath it, and the seagulls were... And I nearly couldn't move from the lights because it was so magical watching the seagulls, which is beautiful. So it is very difficult to make that sort of connection for people.
It is. And you often see, actually, just on the seagulls, the seagulls are fed by people. Because I frequently see people go down to the quays in Dublin and they're throwing bread or food for the birds. And obviously that person feels they have a connection and they're getting some pleasure or some joy from doing that. And I think that's a wonderful sight. Obviously, animals can present problems, plants can present problems. But obviously, I think there is a deep need in a lot of us to feel that connection with nature, even if you're in the heart of a very busy and sometimes very polluted city.
Yeah, it is. Well, look, thank you very much for curing that problem with your wand. It was brilliant to talk to you today, Pádraic. Thank you so much for taking the time. And I really recommend the book, Whittled Away, just to show everybody, the abundance of wildlife and species in Ireland and how we can tackle these things and protect what we have and, work on growing our biodiversity here, which is a very positive thing. So, Thank you very much, and I hope you stay safe, and we'll talk to you again.
Thank you very much, Mary. My pleasure.
Come up to the Burren Nature Sanctuary and have a look around. Thank you for listening to the Nature Magic podcast. Please feel free to get in touch for any reason whatsoever. We would love to hear suggestions as to who you would like to hear speaking on the podcast, or any other questions. I will put my email in the show notes. Please visit the Burren Nature Sanctuary website at www.bns.ie and follow us on Facebook and Instagram to find out all about us. We welcome contributions towards our conservation projects and animal adoptions. Links to these can be found on the website shop page. And we also sell some beautiful locally sourced Irish gifts, such as wild Atlantic seaweed baths, avoca rugs, and Irish fairy tales. We have gift cards for entrance when we are open again. All support is greatly appreciated. We will be back next Monday. Stay safe.